Hello, everybody. I hope you're doing all right, as best as you can for the time being. I just wanted to go over this week's lesson, this week's assignment, studying an art historical work on a formal level. The reason we are doing this is because more than just looking at a work of art and talking about it, understanding how it works, its color works, its perspective, its arrangement, its composition, all this stuff you can understand at a much more visceral level, a much more intuitive level if you are working with it as well. So the studies we're going to do are ways that you can engage deeply with what is a successful work of art. And I wanted you all to pick your own pieces so that you could bring something to it that is personal. I'm going to teach you a lot about formal things, about how pictures work, but I also want you all to bring sort of what interests you, so that as you do this sort of sometimes boring work of color mixing and detailed drawing and measuring and all this, you know it's toward an end goal of something that you'll care about. So let me just go over a few terms here, and I'll do a few notes on the assignment. I'll switch to a lecture, and then I'll do a deep dive on each part of the assignment so you're really clear about how you should spend your time. So I wanted you to pick a piece. If you haven't sent it to me, please send it to me, and we'll talk about to make sure it will work for this assignment, and otherwise just talk about works that interest you. Let me turn now to just a couple vocab terms. The word formal analysis, I want you guys to get familiar with that. That's when you're talking about the pieces of a picture, not necessarily the subject, the meaning, or the narrative, or anything like that. It's like, how does this piece of art function? How does this design function? As in, what composition is making us think what? Where is it moving our eyes? What's the color scheme? It's all that formal stuff. So formal analysis is all like the pieces of art that come together. We do that a lot during our crits. When we talk about how perspective works, or the colors, or the drawing skills, the line quality, all these different pieces we're studying are all formal aspects of a work of art. So formal analysis is to describe those. Another term is color research. This one's a little looser. Basically, colors have been the same for a long time. There's definitely changes. The whole history of color is really interesting, switching from organic, meaning like found in nature and altered, to chemistry-based stuff where it's all baked up in a lab. But essentially the colors they create have been the same for a couple centuries, so we're actually working largely with the same palette that was available to artists in the past. So there's a lot to say about the history of color. If you're interested in that, I could teach you a lot. I could send you a lot of articles. It's really quite fascinating. Let's get a little bit into what to do first with your image, and then I'll show you some works. A reference image. If you have a printer, print out a few copies. If you have a color printer, print out a color copy. You'll see why these can help you. But if you don't have that, don't worry. You just have to work a little harder, and you have to spend more time drawing and really carefully, analytically drawing to make sure you get your shapes in the right spot. So although tracing on a printed out small drawing is very helpful, it's not necessary. You can also do it on the computer with like Illustrator, or even like some simple photo editing tools you can draw lines on to sort of figure out your composition. So don't worry if you don't have a printer, but if you do, you should use it. You should always use the tools you have at hand. The size for the pieces that you're going to do, it's all half pages. You don't need to make large versions unless you want to. Great idea to frame the piece. But you also want to make sure proportion. So whichever piece you picked, figure out your proportion so it's correct. That's the only way you can make your composition the same as the composition of the piece you picked, is by making sure your proportions are correct. I will say one more thing on this intro page, and I'm going to say it again at the end. Color mixing. As I look at all your work, and I'm so happy that you've all posted on Blackboard. Your work looks really great, and I'm excited that you're all sort of getting into the paint, but almost all of you need to spend more time in the palette. You have to spend more time mixing. Get comfortable with your palette knife or whatever you're mixing with. I know it might be challenging, but you want to add complexity to your colors by mixing lots of different ones together and making lots and lots of variations. So an overall criticism and piece of advice I would have is, don't just paint colors you like. Paint things that are surprising and dirty and gray and brown, and learn to get comfortable in the in-between areas of color. We can distinguish millions and millions of shades of color with our eyes. So you really want to make use of, like, if you really like a bright color, put something dull next to it, and it will look brighter, for instance. So that's something I've noticed. You all need to spend more time on the palette working out different types of colors. So let's look at some contemporary artists who've sort of quoted art historical references to give you an idea of how this can be done outside of the classroom. Here is Edward Manet, Luncheon in the Grass. It's an enormously famous piece. It's politically sort of rich. There's a whole history of why there's a naked woman in the middle of this luncheon. Anyway, it's all quite interesting. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this piece, it has been a reference for many artists. So I'm going to show you another one that's in the same vein. This is Courbet. These are actually quite similar. It's a trope of having a naked woman in nature. It's just sort of, it's cliched now, but at the time it was like a way to appropriately show a naked woman. So anyway, so here's another similar one, and one more. This is Henri Rousseau. He's a really interesting character. I can tell you about all these artists as we go. I can share more with you. But for the meantime, here's why I'm showing you these three, and I'll go through them again. There's an artist, English artist, but lives in New York, named Cecily Brown. And a lot of her work has interpretations of art historical works. So you can see it's much, much, much looser, but as you can see here, there's a flesh here, like a fleshy tone here, set in like the sort of nature. You can see flowers and leaves and trees and sky, but it's mostly abstract. So she's playing in this middle ground of abstraction and figuration, and this is just a clear art historical reference. You can see formally just the way the composition is. It's quite similar to this one. So this is sort of like what we're doing, interpreting the piece. This is much, much looser, but you can see that there's a lot of elements to it that are actually quite similar to this, particularly the composition, the color scheme, and the placement of the figures, for instance. Okay, so that's Cecily Brown. I will share all these artists with you as well. Let's look at another one here. So this is Géricault's Raft of Medusa, one of the most famous paintings in European art history, Western art history. And here's, again, Cecily Brown's interpretation. She made a whole series of drawings about this. So, again, she's a terrific artist at the top of her game, and she's still looking at art historical works to see, how did they solve these problems? What was their inspiration? What was their particular color theory and their compositional sort of tendencies? So you can see her studying that. Here's another one. This is Delacroix, Eugene Delacroix. He was actually the student of Géricault, that previous artist. Just more French guys. But this piece has been interpreted a lot as well. This whole shipwreck theme is something that's very rich in art history. So you can see where some of this comes from. This is another one by Cecily Brown. And it's not as one-for-one maybe as the other ones, but you can see the boat structure here. You can see the tangled mass of humanity and the hints of that dark green and that dark brown. This is a pretty close reference to this one. She talks about it in interviews as being an inspiration, and she did a few of them. So that's somebody, Cecily Brown, who interpreted sort of Romantic era French painting in a sort of gestural abstraction way. Here's another one. She did a whole series of shipwrecks based on, or inspired on, not necessarily based on that sort of shipwreck tradition. And here's one more. She's quite a lovely painter. Here's another one. This one I don't know the reference to. I just wanted to show you more Cecily Brown because she's a terrific colorist and knows how to stay loose and all that. Really, really nice painter. All right, we're going to do another one. This one is Emmanuel Lutz. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Washington crossing the Delaware. And I'm showing you this because an African-American artist named Robert Colescott satirized it. And a lot of his work satirizes like the sort of grand pomposity of a bunch of, white European artists like making history. Colescott wanted to just sort of send it up and make fun of how sort of silly this whole scene is. Even like it's a great painting and he pays homage to it, but it's also like, this is very sarcastic and sort of dealing with the prejudice of the time, and it's just irreverent, and everything about it is just like a discordant note. I think this piece is really lovely, and if you're interested in Robert Colescott's work, I recommend looking it up. He spends a good bit of his career making fun of self-serious artists, which I like very much. Moving on, The Last Supper, obviously a very, very famous image by Leonardo da Vinci, and it's been used by many artists, including Andy Warhol, and he did a camouflage version of it. You will see this is important for part 3 of our assignment, doing your own color scheme. So this is very clearly like this would satisfy part 3 of our assignment. But again, this is just Warhol using an art historic image. This one's actually a diptych. It's cut down the middle here, so here's just one version. But he's using a very, very famous art historical image with contemporary color scheme to make that sort of interesting juxtaposition of old, new, commercial, religious. It just has all these connotations that are really, really lovely. He did another one in red camo. Pretty fantastic piece. Just it's also like a mix of reverent and irreverent. It's a mix of old and new, and super interesting. If you don't know much about Andy Warhol, I can show you a documentary about him that would be very good for you all. This is Kehinde Wiley, an American artist, graduated from Columbia. I think he's native New Yorker. I think he's from Harlem. But he would cast people in his life and people on the street he met in Harlem in these art historical settings, and he would let them flip through a book of European art history, and he wanted to inject African Americans into like art history to sort of make space for people who are not traditionally represented. He's an absolute all-star of an artist, and he's terrific, and his technical skills are extraordinary. These are very large works, at least 7 or 8 feet square, this one. But here is the piece he is referencing, Napoleon. I think this is Jacques-Louis David. So we have a French Romanticism connection here. So you can see how he took it and changed it. Obviously the background is enormously influential as well. But the African-American figure replacing Napoleon is significant, of course. There's just a lot to say about this, but take a look. I'll post all these pictures as well. And Kehinde Wiley has done this many times. It's just sort of his signature, is to put usually young black men in the positions of historical figures, saints, etc. This is a good one to end on. For now, let's turn to the assignment.